Ian, I regret to inform you that your father escaped last night. I was awoken at 5 from a bare hour of repose by a phone call informing me of this. I was out all night looking for Vernon, knowing that he would probably do his best to find something approaching a forest hill to seclude himself within like he alleges to have done when he first defected during the raid of Newburgh. Lucky for us, the closest thing to that is the Fall Creek area just some hour from us on foot. And the modern world he finds himself in is infested by suburbs, making avoidance of the main roads virtually impossible. Obviously, the most harrowing concern at this point is that he should not succumb to exposure, but I am too tired now to do much of anything, and even with all my energy, I am just one man. It's up to the authorities, God help Vernon. Or God help them, who knows what sort of sorcery is up his sleeves. I won't be going to bed any time soon, as it stands. The moment Vernon was gone, the whole pavilion was an abattoir of chaos. It is more proof of his unnatural effect not just on people, but the very human environment wherever he lays his head to rest. Suddenly gone, it is as though a gaping cavity in the chest of this place has been uncorked.
Those who hunt by night will tell you that the wildest and most vicious of all animals is the tiny shrew. The shrew feeds only by the dark of the moon. He must eat his own body weight every few hours or starve. And the shrew devours everything. Bones, flesh, marrow, everything. In March, first in Alaska, and then invading steadily southward, there were reports of a new species, the giant killer shrew.
Good evening, guys and ghouls, and welcome back to Monster Craze Memoirs, a generational podcast about B-movies. I am your host, Ian Garcia. Almost as long as there's been a Hollywood, people have been talking about setting up a Texas branch of the West Coast film colony, but somehow none of these plans for making movies in Texas has ever turned out to be anything more than an elaborate dream. Now, though, Texas has finally gotten a working motion picture company, one that's actually making a picture. This film operation called Hollywood Pictures Corp. Is the latest enterprise of Gordon McLendon, the busy Texan whose combination of shrewdness, initiative, and capital has made him something of a pioneer in several phases of Southwestern entertainment. For his venture into the realm of movie-making, Mcclendon has imported to Dallas a trio of film veterans whose individual experience coupled with Mcclendon's past successes would seem to indicate that this company will succeed where others have failed before they even got started. This comes from a column by John Buston in the Austin Statesman, published January 20th, 1959, and the production he's referring to are two locally made Texas films, both filmed back-to-back from January to February in 1959 in the Lake Dallas area of Dallas, Texas. These two films were The Killer Shrews and The Giant Gila Monster. I've seen both of the films before, but I've seen The Killer Shrews first, and I believe you were with me the first time I saw it. This seemed like one that was another personal favorite of yours. Like,
it is.
What is it about the Killer Shrews in particular, do you think that...
I like both the pictures as an older individual looking at them. Actually, I always liked The Killer Shrews, but I didn't appreciate how well it was done until I look at it now and see how well the film was shot.
What do you think of the fact that both of these films, though the Killer Shrews in particular, they do have a reputation often they're considered like some of the worst films of all time. What do you think of that reputation?
I don't think so. I think that, I mean, you have to take in consideration, and I don't know enough about the filmography, but the rapidly produced films sometimes lack in a little bit of character delineation, etc. But I thought, all around, this is a pretty good film. I mean,
I have to agree. Like, I did not have fond memories of the first time I saw it. And maybe this is again a function of the status of the print of when I saw it, because I think the first version I saw, it was a DVD, but the copy on it was not in particularly good quality. But the version that we're seeing now is from a DVD of both films published by Retro Media, and it's interesting because the transfers on the Retro Media DVD, they're not restored, but they do come directly from 35mm prints of both movies. And it is interesting because there's definite damage to the film. There's scratch marks at some points. There's even certain points in the Killer Shrews where there's clearly like missing, not whole scenes or sequences, nothing that's going to make the film confusing to follow, but there were like parts of it where the film did seem to jump because there was a damaged portion that was removed. Mm-hmm. But I have to...
It's like a homage that Tarantino does in the
Grindhouse, the missing reel. Yeah, nothing so severe, but...
Yes.
But right. Yes, yes. But I do have to say that I think I'm with you on the idea that I think both films are fairly well made.
I think so. I agree.
And with you. I think the thing... I wouldn't say that they're necessarily... I don't necessarily think that there's any... one particular quality of them that I could really boil down as saying is exceptionally well done. I do believe that it may just have been a function of the fact that the man Gordon McLendon, who produced these movies, he did seem to be able to round up a circle of people to help get these very cheaply, very quickly produced movies made. But people who seem to, who they may not have been fond of the subject matter in particular, but do seem to have had I don't know what you might call it, a better work ethic, do you think you would say? Like, it seems like, particularly the cinematography of the movies, a lot of it is day-for-night photography that we're used to seeing, but of all the day-for-night cinematography we've seen, this is some of the best that I've seen, and I think as far as the technical limitations of the Killer Shrews, at least, mm-hmm. It seems that the filmmakers were very aware of where they were limited. I think Bill Warren in Keep Watching the Skies, he comments on this, that the production never overextends themselves. They never try to do things that they can't get done on the cheap resources they have. And besides that, I think there are really some rather ingenious elements of the film. I think one of the things that I like most about it and being able to see it again is the way the titular Killer Shrews, which are these more products of mad science. They're these giant shrews, these genetically engineered creatures that eat 3 times their own body weight every day, or else they starve and are hunting down this group of people who are locked inside this small cabin laboratory and are just trying to escape from the secluded island where these experiments are being carried out. But the shrews themselves are coonhounds that have been dressed up in these sort of number one, they have like these masks, these hooded masks that have these long fangs on them, but they also have this long sort of matted hair all over their bodies. And it is odd because on the one level it's not convincing, but on another level, I do have to say, I did find myself being genuinely unnerved every time we saw the shrews, and I think it comes down to number one, it comes down to a combination of the sound effects. I think the sound effects do a good job of contributing to a sense of, these...
Can't get that teeth sound, the grinding teeth.
Also, just they're like little yipping noises. Right. They're very creepy, but also just the way they move.
Yeah, well... but to say, I think the photo, I don't know if you can tell me why this is done this way, but it has that jerky quality to it that makes it very how do you say?
Unnatural.
Yeah, like they're like almost like Danny Boyle in 28 Days Later, where the creature comes at you with a jerky kind of motion and it's right on top of you.
Well,
But this was done
well,
differently.
in that case, that effect in something like 28 Days Later, where it's the zombies, that effect would be achieved by adjusting the shutter speed on the camera. So you might be recording at 24 frames per second, but you adjust the shutter speed so that the amount of times that light is exposed to an individual frame or a series of frames, the effect is that you think that something is moving faster than it actually is. In this case, it seems what they did in a certain amount of scenarios is that they either recorded the shrews themselves or the coonhounds, the actual stars of the movie. It seems they recorded them. They either recorded them at 24 frames per second and then re-projected them at a faster speed, or they did the old-fashioned silent film technique where you'll recognize this from like old silent comedies where like you see Buster Keaton or Charlie Chaplin getting chased down by the cops and everyone is like running at a really unnaturally fast clip. The way that you would do that is that you would just record 14 or 12 frames per second when projected at 24 frames per second, so it creates this illusion of incredibly
speed,
fast
stealth.
movement.
Yeah.
But obviously the consequence of that effect is that it doesn't look natural. It looks obviously sped up, and here it does I think it enhances the effect of the shrews moving in this very unnatural and skittish way.
Right. Which is really terrible, because not terrible, but in contrast to the coonhounds then chasing people through the forest, they couldn't do it that well. These are close-ups that need to be merged with the shot of the puppet.
That's the other way.
When you
like
go to your face.
The close-ups of the shrews are done with a puppet, and I have to say the puppet itself is a pretty well
even when they shoot it and kill it, right? It's really well done.
And that's the thing is that again, it's not a function of the puppet or the coonhounds being convincing so much as it is that despite the fact that you're not convinced by what you're seeing, what is objectively there is unnatural. It almost has like this nightmarish quality.
That's exactly what I was going to say. Nightmarish or not nefarious. It's the wrong word, but something very the danger. Like it has that feel to it. Like you're right.
There's a lot of like comfort that we as human beings, like on an unconscious level, even if we're looking at something that we know is supposed to be objectively terrifying, like say a lion or a tiger. Just on an instinctual level, there's a lot of comfort that we derive simply from this ability to perceive something as real and coming from something that we know as being grounded in our natural reality, as opposed to something like the shrews where they're so far removed from anything that actually exists in reality. And I think another thing that helps in that regard is the fact that the majority of the film does take place in a single isolated location. I think there is a sense of claustrophobia that it really gets away with, and it is odd because the movie itself does have this reputation by virtue of, the script isn't terribly well written. The actors, besides a few of the character actors, and even in there, the acting isn't too great, and obviously the special effects aren't realistic in a sense, but I do think that there is something... these movies are neglected in terms of how they...
Yeah, but in terms of science, I mean, other worse films rise to the surface. Yeah. And this film should be up in that canon. I think that you're right. I think that, The Creature of Black Lagoon it may be a better picture, but this is
definitely better funded, and it's more
but this is a good film. This is a scary film. I mean, when it's a disc
in the right circumstance after dark.
It's a disquieting film. Even now, seeing it as you're older, and like you said, the technique that they used works for them. The artificiality of the shrews, as you say, works because you see them limited, except in the fact when they're chasing people, then it gives it away. But the limited shots of what you see gives it that eerie, insidious nature to them. Like you have them looking up at the window, And you know they're already in the house. You see them skirt around in the kitchen and into the... You notice that. They don't show you actually them getting in. But you knew what happened.
Right. And again, it comes down...
He looks up, and then next thing you see him running around. It really...
And again, it comes down to a kind of nightmare logic, where like a lot of times in nightmares, like, you know, this
things
fear,
that happen,
right? This fear of looking away, and then suddenly the natural order of things just completely falls apart.
Exactly. It's exactly good way of putting it. Nightmarish. Yep. Absolutely.
And it even seems almost like a precursor of Night of the Living Dead in some ways, because it is a very familiar story of an outsider who comes to this secluded place and finds himself in the company of people who are either hostile to him or are trying to get him out.
Cowards.
Right, exactly, or cowardly, but who in this situation needs to quickly take control, or else everyone is going to be destroyed by this horde that is coming in.
It's a little different, though. In that case, you're right. He does take control pretty early. This guy is more reluctant. He's more of a reluctant hero.
Yeah,
and he doesn't overplay it.
Yeah.
You really can't tell whether he's really interested or because he realizes that his survival is related to everybody else's survival.
Yeah. Let's talk about the main players of this movie, and also, you know, just the people who brought it about. So how about a little background information on Gordon McLendon, the kind of brains behind the killer shrews and the giant Gila monster? I'm not going to do these little intercut biographies for every significant person in the making of this movie. I just think McLendon is definitely the most important one, and he definitely has a very interesting biography on his own. So Gordon McLendon was a Texas native and millionaire entrepreneur. He was best known first as a founder and broadcaster for the Liberty Radio Network. Now, LRN carried a variety of programming, but was most listened to and carries a legacy primarily as a sports station, beginning operations in 1947 out of the Mcclendon family-owned KLIF radio station based in Oak Cliff, Dallas, Texas. At the time, live radio broadcasts of Major League Baseball games were largely the domain of the major league cities. Hence, huge portions of the Midwest and Northeast, and especially the Southwest, were often left completely out of the loop when it came to live sports. So, with the old Scotchman, and that's McClendon, that's the nickname he got as a broadcaster and radio producer, with him, he was providing much of the framing and commentary on these broadcasts. The Liberty Radio Network, basically what they specialized in were highly realistic recreations of Major League Baseball games, complete with sound effects facilitated by McClendon's monitoring of a teletyped play-by-play account from the Western Union ticker. The sweeping popularity of this virtually untapped sports radio market led to Liberty Radio Network exploding from a single regional station to a syndicated network of 240 stations in 34 states by the end of 1950. That's like just 3 years. It really exploded. The network soon expanded into music and sponsored comedy drama programming, but its bread and butter remained sports, bringing its network to 431 stations in 43 states in the late summer of 1951, second nationally at the time only to the Mutual Broadcasting System. So the Liberty Radio Network's big moment and its swan song came hot on the heels of the September 1951 purchase of a Manhattan affiliate station, which allowed McClendon himself to have a mic in front of the broadcast, this time a actual live broadcast of the National League playoff series, the famous one between the New York Giants and the Brooklyn Dodgers. This was the shot heard around the world game. So, the WMCA AM radio broadcaster Russ Hodges, his live commentary, and especially when he was he's the guy who went down as kind of having the most iconic window and having the most iconic commentary of Bobby Thomas's decisive home run off Dodgers pitcher Ralph Branca. But it was actually the old Scotchman, Mcclendon, who was heard by the vast majority of radio listeners nationally. Again, he was serving a much bigger market that, generally speaking, didn't have access to major league games before the Liberty Radio Network. By the end of the year, however, Mcclendon would find himself on the defensive against the always hostile MLB clubs. So, they ended up jacking up the broadcast rights to their games from $1,000 a game to $225,000 a year under the pretext that LRN and others were eating into attendance of minor league games. And, already stretched thin as an enterprise, Mcclendon's aspirational grasp was always a little further than his financial reach. He was kind of known for spending more on affiliate stations than they were actually getting back to him. The Liberty Radio Network was kind of DNR by the summer of 1952. KLF survived, though, and as did the Mcclendon family's regional communications empire, and they also ended up expanding into oil and real estate during this time, becoming, one of the really big families in Texas. They started transitioning from sports to music and news. Mcclendon again pioneered the radio format in this way. He found renewed success by introducing the top 40 format to his stations, as well as PAMS jingles, traffic reports, and finally editorials often delivered by Mcclendon himself. He was a lifelong conservative independent. He was sometimes affiliated with the Democratic Party, the Republican Party, or the Libertarian Party. He's an often neglected forefather of right-wing talk radio in this way. All of that is going to become particularly important once we start actually talking about the kind of ultra-rarefied politics of the killer shrews, and especially the giant Gila monster. But anyway, Mcclendon also expanded his entrepreneurship into film exhibition, opening a chain of more than 40 movie theaters called Mcclendon Theaters, which also included many drive-ins. So that's sort of the setup to where we're at, where he then decides, okay, I want to try moving from just film exhibition. I now want to dip my fingers into low-budget film production. And you heard in that John Buston article, you hear how it's very much related to, at least in the case of Texas, where, the difference with something like The Blob is that there's really no film history in Pennsylvania per se. Not that there was never any film production, but it's certainly not a state that has ever had a pronounced history of attempting to create their own independent film industry or their own colony of the major West Coast and East Coast cities. Whereas in Texas, there's a really long history of that sort of attempting to establish the Lone Star State as its own, basically as a competitive industry, as one that could serve the broad Southwest and Midwest of America, whereas the coastal cities, again, it's almost like the same thing with radio. The distribution of films has always been limited. We have this idea of these mediums as being these mass media that have this total permeation everywhere, but it's not really the case. Like in the case of Texas, there's been commercial filmmaking in Texas since the 1900s, either, especially out of San Antonio, that was a particular site of either independent production or there being a colony of a West Coast or an East Coast studio. Some examples are Patrick Sylvester McGeeney's Lone Star Company, later the Shamrock Photoplay Company. There was National Pictures Care Phillips Productions, Jameson Film Company. One of the most interesting film companies in Texas history would be Alfred N. Sack Amusement Enterprises, and they specialized notably in the creation of what were known as race films. And a race film is a term that was used at the time to refer to extremely low budget features and shorts that featured primarily black characters, and sometimes made by black filmmakers. albeit with a lot of white entrepreneurial backing. But nonetheless, these were films that were created to be catered specifically to segregated black audiences throughout the Southwest and throughout the southern states. And so, so you have this whole film history, but the case remains that most of these companies simply don't survive for more than a few decades because of the hegemony of the Hollywood studio system and just its eventual permeation throughout the American film exhibition ecosystem, and so eventually Texas basically just becomes known as a state where there still is commercial filmmaking, but a lot of it is more of the commissioned and industrial variety. So as weird as it seems, the killer shrews and the giant Gila monster, it does sort of evolve out of almost like a kind of naive dream of once again trying to jumpstart, particularly at this point where the West Coast film industry was in decline, when because of competition from television, because of the divestment, the compelled divestment of studios from their exhibition holdings, because of the Paramount case, and because of the termination of some of their monopolistic practices, there is this renewed moment for regional filmmakers to come in and, just like with radio, for Mcclendon to serve a market of southwestern and midwestern theaters that suddenly, now that Hollywood is producing even less films, now need more commodity to round out their annual schedules. But there's also, again, the sort of dreamy idea of sort of using these movies as a way to start up Texas film industry. And Mcclendon is even quoted in another piece in the Austin Statesman from February 3rd about the Killer Shrews. This is the first time a feature-length picture has ever been produced in Dallas, as far as we know. Several attempts started big but wound up regrettably. What we are trying to do is make pictures in Dallas on a reasonable and very professional basis. And so Mcclendon starts up his own production company, Hollywood Pictures Corporation. He only produced 3 movies under this company. The first 2, The Killer Shrews and The Giant Gila Monster. And then he produced another in 1960 called My Dog Buddy. I have not seen that one. I don't really have any interest in seeing it. But eventually, the dream kind of died. But let's talk about the people who he brought on to help make this movie. The probably the first one of note is the director Ray Kellogg. He didn't really have a background in directing per se. He was primarily known as a visual effects man. He did most of his work under contract for 20th Century Fox. His credits there include The Day the Earth Stood Still, Gentlemen Prefer Blondes, The Robe, How to Marry a Millionaire, The 7-Year Itch, The King and I, The Girl Can't Help It. Kellogg was a good friend with John Ford. He met him during their Navy days as part of the OSS field photographing branch. And he was also good friends with John Wayne, and eventually he would co-direct with John Wayne the very controversial 1968 movie, The Green Berets, which was made as a pro-Vietnam War film in specific response to the kind of anti-Vietnam tenor that was growing throughout the time. That's certainly a movie that has aged very well. But so yeah, you have Ray Kellogg. This is his directorial debut, and I guess it makes sense that we have talked about how there is a sort of self-conscious approach to the limitations of the film that I do think come from the fact that he was a special effects man, that I think he very knowingly understood what his limitations were and therefore how to not overplay or to try to sell more than he could deliver. So I think that maybe has an effect on the movie itself. The movie ends up being co-produced by Ken Curtis. Now, Ken Curtis was a singer turned character actor, He was best known at this point in his career for supporting and bit roles in musical comedies and westerns, particularly the works of John Ford. It turns out he was actually John Ford's son-in-law by second marriage, and he was also a friend of John Wayne's. So again, we're slowly building upon this.
That's why since he shows up in the Searchers.
Yeah, we're slowly building upon this small inner circle of who's making this like Texas independent movie. Appropriately, it's this small inner circle of Western stars and Southern and Midwestern born actors and producing and filmmaking types. You know, and it's hard to know how I couldn't find any information of how Mcclendon actually formed these contacts, but I guess when you're like a Texas millionaire, it's kind of easy to find, it's kind of easy to find connections in that way. But
who was the producer on it?
Both Mcclendon and his father, B.R. Mcclendon, produced the movie with Curtis, so they're the producer.
Curtis probably knows the other people, I would suspect.
Right, exactly. Like that's what I'm thinking.
Yeah.
And of course, this is sort of far off, but beginning in 1959, the same year as The Killer Shrews, Curtis, he would get his best known role, which is Festus Hagen, the cantankerous sheriff's deputy of Gunsmoke, which was a character he played for 11 years.
That's right.
So again, like this guy who's synonymous with and he also appears in the movie in a supporting role as the cowardly,
Farrell. Jerry Farrell,
the cowardly Jerry Farrell, who is one of the best, and he's a great character actor in this movie, and again, it comes down to this it's another aspect of the movie that I think is downplayed when it's criticized as one of the worst of all time, because there's definitely some very good character acting, particularly between Ken Curtis and the star of the movie, James Best, who plays our hero Thorne Sherman, who is a boat captain. James Best is kind of in the same position as Curtis. He's another of these Western supporting and bit players. He was entering into a new era of popularity due to his frequent guest spots on Western television in the 50s. Other people involved in the production, include Wilfred M. Klein. He was a director of photography. He had worked behind the camera in Hollywood since the late 20s. Aaron Stell, who was the editor for the film, he had worked there since 1943. So unlike a lot of regional filmmaking examples, none of the people involved in this film were kind of green. A lot of them were very experienced performers or acting veterans or filmmakers, and the cast is rounded out by Ingrid Good, who plays the leading lady, the daughter of the main scientist. Her name is Anne in the movie. She was a Swedish actress and beauty queen. She was previously under contract for Universal, where she kind of had left the company because they just gave her nameless and bit roles, and the most that she had ever been known for at that point were some guest spots on the Bob Cummings show. Some other weird entries into this cast, the guy who plays her father in the movie, Dr. Marlowe Craigus, is played by Baruch Lumet, who was the father of director Sidney Lumet. His work, he's really not known for his film acting work. He's primarily known for the theater, and at the time that he was filming the movie, he was the director of the Dallas Institute of Performing Arts and the Knox Street Theater. And so, you have this weird conglomeration of, I guess you could say, people who are, it sort of reminds me of certain interviews I've had for jobs where people say, you are overqualified for this position. There's a lot of people involved in this movie who were definitely overqualified for the position they were given. So let's talk about the story of the movie. Do you want to talk about start us off establishing where are we at the beginning of The Killer Shrews?
Well, just the fact that they're experimenting on shrews to check population density and studying what happens to a population when it reaches carrying capacity. And his theory is that if you
this is the Dr. Marlowe Craigus character.
If you increase the size of the animal, it will slow down, and therefore it will extend the time of life for an animal, and therefore to be less population. It's one of those things that when writers write science, they don't write well.
Yeah,
So,
it really doesn't make any sense.
No.
Like, as soon as he brought up, like, the sort of... Because that's the thing, is that, like, it doesn't matter, but it's just this...
It would have been better to just leave that out and just say we're doing experiments with population, and they accidentally worked on a group that grew.
Yeah, it just seems like a bit of this exposition that's
Right.
there to pad out
Right.
the plot and probably... But I mean, let's start even further, like, with our characters. All right, so who is James Best playing? This Thorne Sherman character. Who is he? Like,
He's a boat, probably just a mercenary boat person who does things, right? Picks
yeah,
up
he's
people,
a boat captain, yeah.
just sort of like Humphrey Bogart.
Yeah, in the Queen, the
right.
African Queen,
Or
yeah.
Key Largo.
Or
He's
Key
the same
Largo,
thing in
yeah.
that one too, right? He's a boat guy. So it's like that. He's like that.
Very,
But not as good.
Yeah,
That's
yeah. James Best does all right.
He does all right,
He
yeah.
he does have a sidekick, a black actor who appears in this movie in a kind of supporting, well, not a kind of supporting role, but I guess I was trying to find a delicate way of saying a kind of exploitative role. He plays the actor is Judge Henry Dupree. He seems to be just a Dallas native who was just kind of knew the filmmakers and was cast in the movie in a supporting role. He doesn't seem to have had any acting experience before this, but he plays the first mate of this small ship, who is the first victim of the bands of feral shrews, while the captain is sitting comfortably in the cabin with the main scientist. So James Best comes ashore. He's supposed to be picking up Ingrid Good's character, but there's a hurricane a-brewing, and so he shacks up with them for the night. And he's intent on leaving
Right.
as soon as possible.
That's right.
But Ingrid Good kind of her character Anne manipulates him into staying. So that basically he can help protect her and her father from these horrible abominations, and then eventually it has to be told to James Best of why they can't leave the cabin and why they're in such mortal danger. Ken Curtis plays Anne's would-be fiance Jerry Farrell, who is in all of the ways that James Best's character is this absolute, paragon of definitely, again, a Western character, but not in a Western movie. He's like a paragon of masculinity and bravery, and
Except he's a coward.
like you mentioned, he's also a strident individualist, and almost to like a scary degree of how individually focused he is, because there is that line where he says that Ingrid Good is just she expresses to him her concern that you're the most uncurious man I've ever met, you don't care about anything that's happening, and he does say I don't think about anything that
Except myself and my boat.
Yeah, myself and my boat.
You're a strange man, Thorne. You seem so disinterested in everything. Aren't you the least bit curious?
I'll tell you something. I'm only interested in anything that concerns me, then I do something about it.
But Ken Curtis characters, by contrast, Jerry is just this constantly drunk, incompetent, always leaving doors open so that killer shrews can get in. And also totally cowardly and paranoid.
Yeah, I like the exposition where we learned that she's fault because he tried killing her to get into the apparently exposition, right?
Yeah,
when I found out what a coward you are, I don't love you.
Yeah, there was apparently a situation where the shrews were after them, and he just ran away instead of trying to defend her. Curtis and James Best are definitely the best actors in the movie. And I think
by far
they have a good repertoire between each other too, and it's unfortunate because there's no way I can really clip this performance so that it's just sound, but there's this. Again, it's sort of this thing that I think really defeats the accusation that these movies are particularly poorly made, because there's clearly aspects that are very well done, And their performances in this are an example. There's this one scene where, everyone's having a drink, everyone's getting, like, the exposition dump of, it's like, all right, why we need to stay here, what do we need to do to survive the night. And at one point, Ken Curtis's character just takes James Best's drink from him and just sculfs down the scotch and gives James Best the his own empty glass while he's not looking. Then Curtis goes to the bar and makes his own drink, and as soon as he comes back, James Best just does the same exact thing to him and takes his drink, gives him the empty glass, takes his drink, and wolfs it down. And then it's great because Ken Curtis just looks at the empty glass and then just goes right back to the bar.
No, it isn't. The timing's beautiful.
It doesn't break the flow of their acting. They're doing it with such confidence and aplomb.
It's almost as if in the heat of the moment of this terror, right? Because I think James Best gets punched out because Jerry thinks he's leaving a compound, but he wasn't leaving a compound. He just wanted to check and see what was going on. He wasn't going to go out the gate. And then that's where the drink scene starts, right?
Yeah.
So to them, they both chug at the same time, and then, like you said, then you have this whole potadoo. It's absolutely fluid.
It's a wonder, and that's the thing,
cool.
that there's a choreography between them and again, it's not obviously this was a very quickly produced film, and they didn't have a lot of time for takes, but clearly they planned that out. Like, I don't believe that anybody wrote in a script that, like, all right, and then there's this
comic relief area.
Exactly. But that's the thing. Yeah, there's this wonderful sense of comic relief.
Right.
I think it really helps tie the movie together, and just, it gives you something to relate to in a way that you really don't see that level of investment in terms of, like, again, not just having the characters say the lines, but giving them something to do, keeping them active within a scene, like have Ken Curtis walk off camera and then walk back on, and then, but despite its limitations, there's a depth to it.
Yeah, but there's something else about it, and that's why I think it was written in. And the reason I think it's written in, because both men, the captain says it, I'm only interested in myself, and Ken Curtis's character,
Jerry Farrell,
is only interested in himself. But so there's some kind of camaraderie in that.
Well, it's almost like he's the dark side of,
not necessarily. I
like,
think
the dark obverse of him.
So after punching him out, all of a sudden there's some kind of community now between these two men, not as rivals. I think it's a very interesting 20 seconds.
I do think James Best and Ken Curtis
do a
fantastic job of grounding the movie.
Yes,
and I do think that they do sort of,
and they know it.
They also but they also sort of define the themes of the story, because this is like a classic two-fisted adventure tale where you have, the stalwart brutalist hero. Again, it's like, that's why I think they're kind of obverse of each other, because you're right, they're both totally individually fixated and egoist in the way they act. But Ken Curtis is sort of like the dark obverse. It's like where it can go totally to the side of complete narcissism and disregard for others. Whereas, like, again, James Best is like this classical Western hero who is just, despite all of his individualism, he's possessed by this drive to do the right thing and to help others. And he's grounded in a sort of way.
You never know. You always expect Ken Curtis maybe to come around.
Maybe
that's the sense that
because you don't want him to just be this pathetic lowlife.
Right. Oh, sorry, you have to cut that out now.
No, I don't.
But anyway, you know what I'm trying to say. But
I do know what you're trying to say, and
I think there's something that's another good point. I mean, that's why it was such an enjoyable movie. It wasn't poorly done.
Yeah, I think there's some genuinely intense scenes.
Yes,
and it does help that there's such good actors, specifically their rapport with each other, because they are the best actors in the movie, and it does contribute to some of the intensity of the later half of the movie, where it's now just the survival part. It's about these two competing egos in this very fragile space. And so there's the threat. There's a wonderful sort of threat to the movie, because it's not just about the killer shrews outside. It's about the clash between these wills that could destroy everything before the shrews even get to anybody.
Well, he's irredeemable.
Yeah.
You still don't want him
there's
to,
this...
But you don't want him to die, even though he tries to kill James
Yeah,
Best.
yeah. So what happens is that, okay, so eventually what happens is they have to do a reconnaissance to go out and get the boat so that they can head back.
Right.
They find that they're the
first mate is now...
The first mate has been eaten. All that's left behind is his tattered shirt and a belt.
And one shoe.
I'm
sorry.
No, it's true. But like, okay, let's talk about Judge Henry Dupree and as the only black character in this movie. Now, there's this sort of trope of horror movies, which is kind of overplayed, but it exists for a reason. And that trope is, if there is a black man in a horror movie, they are going to die first. Now, on one hand, that trope is unfair because, not for good reasons, it's unfair because, black people, especially at this time, were virtually never cast in roles of any significance or any speaking roles or anything even close to this movie where James Best's character is like, he's not just an employee of James Best's character. Like when he finds out that Dupree's character, Rook Griswold, when he finds out he's dead, he's like legitimately like pissed off. Right. It's like, it seems like he's the only person in the world he has really any...
Well, he even says that to Ingrid in the house. It says, well, it'd be a lot better to have you with me than having to talk with so-and-so the entire time on this boat. I've been stuck with him for years. Yeah. It'd be good. It's a very interesting thing. But the recognition of how intertwined those two characters are for the survival of their business.
Right.
Sure is a lot of quiet out there. Almost smell it, can't you?
No, but I can feel it. The pressure's dropped so fast, it's almost made my ears pop.
Hurricane's got different ways of telling you it's there. Where is it?
Again, it's like during the time, it's like there really aren't, there's just an absolute dearth of black roles in any filmmaking of this kind. And so while he is playing a fairly stereotypical role, like he is kind of...
Did you get a sense that he almost looked like a prisoner? I mean, there's something about his garb. When you take that close up, it almost looks like it has stripes. It was. I
think we're meant to understand that he's kind of a he's kind of like Thorne Sherman's character. I think we're meant to understand that he has like a history with him that is maybe not always reputable. But like I think the fundamental problem is that he kind of just exists. I guess what I'm trying to convey is that it's like this is a sort of it's kind of the part of the movie where we start to... I remember the first time I saw the movie, and I remember the visceral feeling of discomfort I got when I saw a bunch of dogs dressed up as monsters, but clearly dogs nonetheless, chasing a black man through the woods and then up a tree.
Right.
In order to be slaughtered.
Right.
Like, it's like I was only in high school at the time, I thought. So I didn't really have a very pronounced understanding of the history of slavery or anything, or of Jim Crow or of lynching. But even then, just like the impression that it gave me, and it still gives me this impression to this day, like I get this visceral repulsion to the scene, and it is genuinely uncomfortable.
It is repulsive.
It's like, and it's,
I guess the whole sense
it's a very loaded image, and it seems like he only
hounds going after a black man up a tree.
Yeah, it's
so
just,
you have all the symbolism of lynching.
Yes.
You have the symbolism of punitive nature.
Yep.
Most blacks, of course, back then it was still pretty widely known that they're in prison, and also I mean there's a lot of how do you say it, cultural what do you call it when you take something from something? Cultural...
almost like an appropriation.
Appropriation. And that's thank you. That's exactly what I'm trying to say here. And that whole scene, you're right, it is a very disturbing scene. even though they don't show anything. They don't have to.
Yeah, he just sort of falls into the brush, and then the dogs descend upon him.
Well, the tree comes down, right?
And again, like, I think the scene would have been just as tense if it were a white actor.
Yes.
It's like I'm not like
Yes.
I do
No,
want to
you're right.
like
Right.
I do think again it's an example of a genuinely tense and unnerving scene. Like, I think that the actor Dupree, he does a very good job of performing his character,
Right.
despite not being a professional actor. But it's sort of like, this is sort of the prosaic example of a black actor who exists to be a casualty in the story, like an easy person to like set up to dispose of, who then, you know, is sort of like it's sort of basically, yeah, it's just sort of it's an exploitative like way of sort of, you know, because you know, there's a novelty to his being cast at all because he is a black man. Even in a weird way, it's almost like a sort of like folksy appeal to the novelty of the movie. Like, you know, here it is in Texas, we know who we are. There are black men in Texas, white people work with black people here in Texas. You know, like, there's this almost pastoral Huck, Finn, and Jim quality to the relationship between
true.
James
Right.
Best.
Right.
It's like this idyllic image of this sort of camaraderie that crosses racial boundaries that absolutely did not exist. And again, it sort of fleshes out where that sort of, you know, that sort of trope comes from, of why, if there's a black man in the horror movie, does he tend to be the first one to die or not live to the end of the picture?
Well, he's not the main
and the
character.
reason is because historically in American popular culture, because we are a country founded in colonialism and in white supremacy and slavery, white characters like James Best's character, or even a villainous character like Ken Curtis, you know, they have the luxury and the privilege of being defined by some ephemeral aspect of their identity, by their virtue, by their strength of character, by all of these things. Whereas Judge Dupree, you know, his shaming in the movie is that his character is defined totally by his profession, totally by his service, by his job.
Yes,
like
that's right.
he never
Right.
gets the actual even if James Best offers him the opportunity to come with him, the writers are not going to give him that opportunity. He has a very narrow role to be served, which is to be cannibalized in the film.
Right. It's almost as if he's locked. His brain is already locked into that servile that he couldn't make a decision to go to the house.
Yeah.
You know something? If this thing had an automatic pilot, I wouldn't have to put up with you.
Then you wouldn't have nobody to chew out.
You know, it's almost as if, like slavery, right?
Yeah.
People knew not to go into the upper quarters of the house. They stayed subterranean, right?
And he's not the only sacrificial person of color in this movie. There's actually a Latino character,
Oh, yeah.
a guy named Mario, played by Alfredo de Soto, who I think is another Dallas local. I can't really find. Oh no, it looks like he actually was a Mexican actor. It looks like there's a lot of Mexican Well, not a
he
lot.
dies too.
And he dies too. Again, he goes with anyone who hangs out with James Best for more than a few minutes tends to die in this movie. You know, eventually, you know, again, Jerry leaves one of the windows open. A shrew gets into the basement, and so Ken Curtis and James Best and Alfredo, they go into the basement to shoot the shrew, and in the process Alfredo gets killed.
Right.
Again, another...
They get the shrew, but... You know,
they get the shrew, but Alfredo dies. Like, again, another person of color in this movie who is defined totally by their service and who is immediately a casualty. The only person who isn't... You know, it's not funny.
No, what I was to talk about is when you mentioned when he says when he's playing drunk.
Right.
In a bed.
Okay, yes, there is a... Okay, there is a...
Play the scene out. It's really funny. But it's your line that made me die when you said it.
Okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to play the scene. Well, let me just say, like, the reason I laughed at it is because there's almost like a... There's an almost, I
double
think...
entendre.
Yeah, there's a double entendre to the scene. This is the drunken Jerry basically totally blitzed out of his mind. He's into a total paranoid stupor.
He's supposed to be his shift to cover guarding the house.
Yeah. So so he believes that because at this point Thorne and Anne are basically in a developing sort of semi-romantic relationship with each other, and so now Jerry is getting very paranoid. So there's a double entendre to this scene where Alfredo comes in and Jerry has a conversation with Alfredo about alliance and who is on whose side.
Here, have a drink. It'll help you to relax.
Gracias, señor.
You're a good man, Mario. A man that can be trusted. You know what I've been thinking about, Mario? Anne and that captain. You and me. Imagine an intelligent girl like her going for a common sea tramp like him. I know why. You do too. In case anything goes wrong, she's looking out for her own hide. That's why I keep thinking about you and me.
Oh no, senor. I'm sorry, like I don't, and that's the other thing is that like I don't know. Again,
that's the way it's written. He says, "What does he say? What's it?"
He goes even further. He does.
Thorne and Anne, you and me.
Oh no! I'm sorry. Like I know I've just complained about this movie being racist. During that scene, I just felt like, all right, I have to I had to vocalize like just what this.
Yeah.
It's a funny scene, but that's the thing. I don't know if it was unintended.
No, I think it was unintended.
Like, because like I don't, but like it does sort of add to like sort of Jerry's demonization.
Well, it's sort of like Anne and Thorne, you and me. But he doesn't put. There's no preposition or separation.
Right, exactly. It's like
maybe it was Ken Curtis that.
Yeah, like I think that I think again I think it comes down to like how Jerry now that it sort of comes down to the same thing of the idea of James Best's character being this two-fisted hyper masculine hero who is uniquely capable to he's the Western hero who is going to get us out of this extra
normal. He doesn't play that though.
He does though.
No, I think he plays the unassuming, what do you call, person that something's been thrust upon him. He comes to the...
But all Western heroes rise to the occasion.
I know, but it's different. He doesn't play it so heavy-handedly.
And I mean, this movie is replete with Western tropes.
Doesn't even kill...
What ends up happening is that the next morning, after the hurricane blows over, they go to the beach to try to see if they can get the lifeboat to get back to the ship. The lifeboat's been destroyed. And so they now have to go back to the shack and try to figure out another way to get them off the island and back to the boat and back to safety. Ken Curtis.
It seems he's gonna kill.
Ken Curtis's character tries to kill James Best twice. The first time is when they're walking to the boat, and he literally points his shotgun right at James Best's back. But because Jerry is kind of. He's what the Texans would say, he's all hat and no cattle. So, like, the actual cowboy, James Best, just basically punches his lights out and takes his shotgun from him. But, yeah, then eventually they're being chased by the shrews. Jerry, because he's a coward, he runs faster, so he gets to the cabin first, and he immediately locks the gate behind him, and James Best has to crawl over the fence. And James Best immediately, James Best almost kills him. He almost, he takes up Curtis in his arms and he's about to throw him over. And then again, we have this like sort of classic Western hero moment where he looks at them. We have this intense exchange of glances where he's like, ugh. I want to kill this bastard, but I just can't do it because I'm a civilized man. Again, classical sort of Western.
I know, but it was not just there. I don't think it's heavy-handed. But I don't think there's some kind of ambivalence that Best brings to the character that doesn't feel as heavy-handed as being the the hero. This is my
think,
impression.
but this is the thing. I think, again, this is why I think this movie is so replete with tropes of the Western. Whether it's the isolated outpost in the middle of nowhere, whether it's the... and even the imagery of, like, the fences, these rickety fences, which are the only defense against, like, the shrews might as well be the savage Indians that are trying to get at them.
Right, it's like Fort Apache or something, right?
James Best, again, as this, like, sort of this cowboy, this guy who just wanders from place to place, working for the Yankee dollar. Who comes into this place and he's only concerned with himself, but, like, the arc of justice demands that he rise to the occasion. But I think the ambivalence of that scene, what you're talking about, again, you have to remember, this is post-Stagecoach. This is the 50s of Westerns. We're already getting into the part of Western history where we're having this sort of revisionism, where we're having movies like The Searchers, which is all about John Wayne as this ambivalent character who has to, he's the archetypical strong man who has to be there in order to put down the savages and rescue the white woman. But at the same time, there's this tension in the movie because he's so savage, he's so brutal, that he's walking this fine line of when will he eventually just flip over and totally be unable to engage with civilization. I think that this example in the movie where James Best is about to kill Ken Curtis's character, just throw him to the dogs, I think that's what this moment is that this is the moment where he is brought to the living edge of the last thing that is actually holding him to, like, civilization or any kind of society.
Maybe.
And then he's pulled back right at the moment, despite the fact, again, that James Best gets a wonderful line in the movie where he's just like...
All right, didn't he have it coming, or didn't he?
What happened out there?
Oh, nothing much. Jerry just tried to kill me twice in the last 5 minutes.
You definitely feel his aggrievement at, like, really don't want me to...
he's lying.
Exactly. It's like,
But he gets his comeuppance.
Yeah, Jerry gets his comeuppance because
he's stupid.
So yeah, we're getting.
He would be better off staying on the damn roof.
Yeah,
because they were about to kill each other anyway and die of starvation.
Yeah, that's the other thing. Yeah, so the shrews are about to get in, but they come to a last minute ingenious plan. Again, a genuinely good idea that is limited by the technicalities of the film. They basically just get 4 steel drums, rope them together, and basically create like a small mini tank of themselves. And they're just...
They're going to walk all the way to the freaking beach.
But like the way James Best's character puts it, we're going to duck walk all the way to the beach. That's like 5 miles, I think.
I think it's 5 miles.
It's like far. It's several miles, and immediately I felt my hamstrings hurting. I was just like, oh, that's awful.
And he cut slits in it. Really ingenious.
The slits in it offers there's these wonderful sort of point of view shots through the slits. Again, very good use of like limited special effects that I feel were genuinely unnerving and genuinely tense. You definitely
well done shots. Well done.
And of course,
the camera angle is through the slit, looking at the people, with enough light on their faces.
It's
really
very evocative stuff.
And
I think and then of course Jerry dies because he's such a cartoonish coward and drunken fool that he just climbs to the top of the roof and refuses to come down and says, "It's too late. You got to get going." And that's the thing. You think it's going to be like maybe a redeeming moment for him. Like for a second, I thought what he was going to do was try to distract the shrews.
For some stupid reason. He's a scientist, by the way.
Yeah, he's another scientist.
He would know that if he just sits on a roof, they're not going to get up on the roof. So he could just wait for him to starve.
But he can't get booze up there.
He can't get booze up there. But the point is that he thinks that the tank system has distracted all the shrews. So he's going to get down and make a run for it. Where he's running to, I don't know. Right. Probably to the boat.
Maybe, he thinks he's going to get there first.
And then swim, right?
Yeah.
But he doesn't, of course.
Gets his comeuppance.
That's it. He gets
like nature always, life finds a way.
Fittest.
Yeah, exactly. But then when they wonder, like I thought, again, I'm not trying to say this is masterpiece theater or anything.
I
think there's enough stuff that is genuinely well done in
Yeah,
this movie, and
yeah.
it keeps your attention.
And not only
very
that, but the
well.
idea is the Mcclendon
Yeah.
does a pretty good job.
Yeah, I forgot to mention Mcclendon appears in this movie.
As
the
whatever-
Assistant. He's
yeah,
like the
Craig, whatever his name, Randolph something.
he just plays some.
Oops.
He just plays some assistant to Baruch LeMay's character. He's playing a guy named Dr. Radford Baines. He
Radford
also
Baines. Good job.
also gets killed. The killer shrews are poisonous, by the way. They try to poison
They're
the
poisonous
screws.
because they try to poison him, and
They assimilate the
chief-
poison somehow.
The chief scientist tried to kill them by a concoction which had no remedy or antidote. So it was whatever it is, and it collects in their salivary glands, and so when they bite, the toxicity is multiplied hundredfold because it's concentrated in the salivary gland. Very interesting, well done concept. I think it's a remarkably good concept.
It's but here's and so now like
Really well done. So well
it's weird.
written
It's like
script.
this is
it
one of
actually
the
isn't a poorly
but,
written
but
script.
here's the thing about the use of how the shrews come about is that I think this is like the first of these. Well, not the first, but it's one of the first of these sort of modern sci-fi movies. One that's not a gothic horror. One that's sort of definitely a sort of modern sci-fi adventure. It's one of the first ones where radiation isn't involved in what happens. It really is just a
genetic
couple
engineering.
of a
Right,
couple of
right.
eccentric scientists
Right.
who are playing God, and
Right.
it's like, and of course the
Not
rule
playing
is,
God. They're trying to do something.
well, they're trying to solve world hunger and overpopulation. That's called playing God in my book. Again, it's like this idea of isolation and all of these motifs of the Western and of this ideal of the traditional masculine, Western hero. And even at the very end of the movie, like at one point in the movie, Ingrid Good's character, who is also a scientist, like she's a professional working woman.
You
would never know it. But at like one point in the movie, like he's literally having a conversation with her, and she's like, after this, I just want to settle down and become a housewife.
If we ever get off this island, I'll never have anything to do with it again.
What will you do?
Live normally, like normal women do. You see, it seemed a little dull after the life I've been living. Rather dull and alive than excited and...
I'll take a dull, alive woman every time.
And of course they end up shipped together at the end of the movie. And it's like they're going to be a married couple. And so there's also this very arch traditional gender roles. Everything in the movie is so wrapped up in this much more distinctly conservative worldview. And I think it's notable because a lot of the movies that we've seen have had at least some semblance of social critique, at least some semblance of whether it's like the dangers of a conservative adult society that doesn't trust the younger generation, or whether it's the dangers of nuclear contamination, or in like maybe in It Came from Outer Space, like the dangers of reactionary human society destroying like peaceful visitors, or in The Day the Earth Stood Still, you could think of that. It does seem that, like, there's something very specifically, staunchly conservative about the entire narrative of the movie.
I think it's typical, don't you think?
I mean, I think...
all during that era, it's like that. I mean, it's not new.
I think it's typical in terms of it being reactionary. Like, I don't think there's a lot of these movies that function particularly well as social criticism.
Right.
But I do think there's something to be said about just how many of these different motifs coalesce into this single movie. And that I think, like, are sort of, again, they're bound up in James Best's character and the situation he's put in. Because nothing that happens in this movie is a product of society gone wrong. It's literally just these eccentric scientists alone, left to their own devices, and who are ultimately end up being kind of defined by Ken Curtis's character as this kind of drunken... Like, he's the worst of them, because, like, he's so cowardly and impertinent that he's, like, not even a real man. And I think it even relates back to this scene, like, the double entendre with Alfredo in a weird way. Because now it's like, that's where I'm thinking it might not have been an unintentional double entendre, that it might have been a deliberate sort of double entendre that is like, it's implying that he's not a real man, like for other reasons, like whether it's the inability
he's being
to
emasculated by James Best.
Exactly. Like there's this whole
I agree. I think you're right. Which means there's a lot of intelligence that went into the script. I mean,
you're right. It's an intelligence, but it's a very conservative intelligence.
And regardless of how it shakes out, whether it was intentional or not, it's so tight that it does shake out. I mean, the idea is that, I mean, one of the things that I want to comment on is that as the shoes get larger, in theory, as an animal gets larger, its energy quotient goes down.
Right.
So they're not going to be eating each other at the rate that they eat when they're smaller.
Which makes it so confusing as to why he wants to shrink human beings so that their energy quotient will go down, because he explains that that's not how it works, but like I completely forget the logic.
Idea.
But
because if you make them smaller, they're going to eat more.
Right.
So therefore, you're not going to do anything about food.
But their energy quotient stays exactly the same once they get really big.
Yeah. That's one of the drawbacks of the film, although a minor drawback, because the exposition of the science really isn't important, is it?
No, it's a very character-focused.
It's a very, very character-focused film.
And good action.
Very
just
good.
Like a good.
Yeah.
It's
well
a good
shot. And it does have Gothic qualities to it.
Yeah,
The
like a
interior
little bit.
scenes, the
Yeah.
adobe. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I mean, it does have a very interesting point that everything's it's tight. Knowledge of adobe. Again, your reference to
It's almost,
Western or more of a
exactly.
Mexican. Adobe is soft when it gets wet.
Yeah,
It's very,
again,
very cool.
Yeah, all of these Western motifs, even just the appearance of a Mexican servant
Yeah.
character, almost like this sort of border affiliation. Again, it's like, it's something that's so different from like the example of The Blob being a Pennsylvania film, where like really all we have is like the specific locale, which is beautiful, and it's different than what you would see in a California-based movie. But with this Texas film, there's so many other like little bits of it that are so defined by a regional character. Like, you really get the sense of that this is not Hollywood.
Right.
This is something that... And because it's not Hollywood, there's absolutely no pretense of any kind of, like, liberal softness. There's no... Like, everything... It's like a... It is just, again, like a two-fisted tale of the ideal, like... masculine hero and Western hero.
And everything's fine except the final line. I'd rather not think about overpopulation, which really wrecks the whole film.
In 24 hours, there'll be one shrew left on the island, and he'll be dead of starvation. An excellent example of overpopulation.
Well, you know something, Doctor?
What's that?
I'm not going to worry about overpopulation just yet.
Yeah, it's like, again, it has to be another one of these like coarse lines about
sexist,
how basically just signposting to the audience, and then they fucked after the movie was over and had babies.
Right,
it's really gross.
At least Alfred Hitchcock shows the train going to tunnel was more subtle. It's pretty overt.
Well, it's funnier,
right?
But yeah, I do.
Father, we left with his pipe.
Yeah, I do want to keep on this beat of like the sort of not just the regionally specific character of the movie, but clearly how it's kind of defined by like a conservative moral worldview, even like a maybe nostalgic.
Yeah, see, I again, with my age and my perspective, it seems typical. I don't see it overtly, as opposed to the next film we're going to review.
Yeah.
That makes my skin crawl, even at 68.
Yeah, all right. So we're gonna take a break, and once we come back, we're gonna talk about the second half.
Another good film.
Another good film, but and the second half of our double feature. But I think which really distills the conservative vision behind these movies. We're gonna be talking after the break about the
giant Gila monster.
Yeah, the giant Gila monster.
Gila,
Stay with
Gila.
us. It's
Spanish.
Yeah.
That's right, Gila's right.
It's not even a Gila monster in the movie.
No, it's a Mexican bearded, you said?
Yeah, it's a bearded lizard.
Mexican bearded
lizard,
right.
yeah.
Which is, I would never know, because it wasn't colored. All right.
Yeah, we'll be right back.
In the enormity of the West, there are still vast and virtually unexplored regions, bleak and desolate, where no human ever goes and no life is ever seen. It is as though the land had been posted by God. It is in these lonely areas of impenetrable forest and dark shadows, that the Gila monster still lives. How large the dreaded Gila monster grows, no man can say.
So this is the movie that I was really looking forward to talking about because it kind of fits into this month's theme of teen-centric horror and sci-fi movies that came about after those AIP movies that we first saw. I think we've already seen that there's not really a specific formula that binds together all of these movies, but we have seen that there's sort of there's two general types to these kinds of movies as they're evolving. One is the film which is more like I Was a Teenage Werewolf or Blood of Dracula, where they're sort of about the teenager as a character who is this burgeoning source of threat and an anxiety to the status quo, someone who is ready to blow at any moment and who can be manipulated and transformed into something horrific. And on the other hand, we have much more clean-cut characters. We have Steve McQueen in The Blob. We have that blonde-haired, blue-eyed future Air Force recruitee from Invasion of the Saucermen. These kids who are not really defined by being, threats to society, but quite the opposite, that these are stories about these young kids having to band together in order to stop a problem that adult society is either unwilling or unable to fend off. And I think, these things are very intimately related to how the youth culture and particularly teenagers were perceived in the 1950s. And, we shouldn't downplay the cultural circumstances in which these movies arose because, teenage crime rates were soaring during the late 50s. There was a genuine concern in the culture because on the one hand, this new market was a unique demographic that could be exploited, whether it was in fashion or music or in movies, especially rock and roll on the radio.
Disposable income, right? Parents, right? After war, right?
Yeah, exactly. And, but there was also this anxiety about the threat that these kids posed. The FBI director, J. Edgar Hoover himself, he compared, the juvenile jungle, as he called it, as a problem that he considered, just as much of a national security threat as communism. And these concerns about youth culture, they've always been attendant to concerns about popular culture and particularly film. Although rock and roll music also, as it developed in the 50s, as something that was perceived as having subversive or pernicious effect on young people.
Right.
And you can see this concern in movies like The Rebel Without a Cause and Blackboard Jungle. There are stories about like kids like in the theaters of Blackboard Jungle like literally rioting in the streets after
Reefer Madness,
right? Or well, sort of, but like once Rock Around the Clock comes on, there are like stories about like kids going out into the streets and raising bedlam and all this other stuff.
Right.
But and so in one way we can see like the sort of that they are despite the fact that there's no real overarching generic type to these teen-centered movies, there is definitely a certain political arc to them, and one is that despite the ways in which these films would incorporate elements of teen exploitation into their movies, whether it's teen-focused characters, themes of juvenile delinquency, lurid tales of violence, more sort of openness about sexuality, especially teen sexuality, more
when adults do, I mean, I don't want to interrupt you because my fog brain, I don't want to forget what I'm doing. So I'm interrupting you, not deliberately, so I apologize. But you're right. When it's from an adult perspective, there's this reductionism, right?
Yeah.
They make the teen life seem so black and white.
Well, they're trying to appeal to a teen demographic on the lowest possible level.
No, but I mean in terms of adults talking about teens, like like the Blackboard Jungle. Teens are much more complicated than that.
Right.
They're not like that at all.
Yeah,
but it's a harder film to make from a teen perspective, and even when it comes from a teen perspective, it's still black and white. It's not.
Yeah, there's
no nuance.
Yeah,
right?
There's a lot of moral simplification
very
of these movies.
Exactly.
Like, I'm not a particular fan of Blackboard Jungle. It's definitely
no, I'm not either.
Not one.
It gets a good rating, but I don't think it's. First of all, no freaking teenager is going to be won over that quickly by some. Thinks he's outsmarting it by playing music to get them over. The biggest guy, like I said, is Vic Morrow, the crazy guy.
Yeah.
He's the most sympathetic character that I can appeal to.
Right.
All the rest I can't. I just can't. And go ahead. I'm going to interrupt you.
But no, you're right. But like that's the thing.
And that's one of the characters here. He is the Sidney Poitier of that movie.
Yeah, but there is you're right. There is this sort of reductionism and this sort of lurid exploitation of the emergent youth market, but just as much, what you see is that, and I'm referring to this one article written by the specific article is an essay that I'm referring to written by Cynthia J. Miller and A. Bowdoin Van Ripper, called Marketing, Monsters in Music, Teen-sploitation Horror Films. It was an article published in the June 2015 issue of the Journal of American Culture. And in that article, they talk about the extent to which these movies, especially these B-exploitation films, they did very much exploit the teen market in terms of giving them these very lurid, or at least advertising their films as these very lurid stories of puerile violence and sexuality and rock and roll. But just as much, they tended to, quote, support existing middle-class relationships, values, and distributions of power within the community. So on the one hand, they added a range of dimension to teen characters. They added a range of dimension in terms of what was acceptable in terms of how young people could express themselves or be expressed in popular culture. But what you see is, it's something that we noted with I Was a Teenage Werewolf, but it's something that you can also note in Blackboard Jungle and Rebel Without a Cause, is that there is this fixation on the idea that, that these are social issue parables in which, the kids need to learn their lesson. They need to learn that they need to, assimilate into conservative society. They need to settle down. They need to put away childish things, because on the other side only lies chaos. And we see the same exact thing in sort of the clean-cut movies, where the kids are not juvenile delinquents per se. And again, there's this added range of dimension where you see in the...
Well, there's a tinge of it, but it's never really
Yeah.
shown.
Well,
so
it's
you
like...
really... Well, I said you,
it's the same thing. Well,
Yeah,
it's like
good.
with the Blob and
it's an assumption.
right. It's in the Blob and Invasion of the Saucermen, you have this acknowledgement that kids are going to Lovers Point and parking and making out and
Right.
drinking and getting
Right.
up to God knows what,
Right.
drag racing in the
Right.
streets, but it's presented without judgment. There's this added range in terms of what is perceived as permissible, but again, especially in the Blob, it all works around to the same narrative where it's Steve McQueen huddled in the basement with his girl and her little brother, and finally getting the town's adults and the kids to unify and put down the threat to their society so that they can continue along a very conservative moral trajectory. So there's always this sort of reactionary variance to these kinds of movies that in the Miller and Van Ripper article, basically their explanation for this is that in one way it's a way of, it's kind of like an ideological safety valve, or it's a plausible deniability. The filmmakers can make and exploit the youth market by appealing to them with this lurid content, this puerilness, but at the same time they can hedge their bets on the side of authority always comes in to save the day. The things that are responsible for the problems are always isolated and eccentric. It's never a systemic problem. And we even debated about that with I Was a Teenage Werewolf, whether it is a social issue in the film that comes from society, or if it's just, a mad scientist that is producing some isolated, eccentric monster. But with the giant Gila monster, we now go to a point of the political trajectory of the movie, of these types of movies, that is tacked so far to the right and is so sanitized that it becomes like, it becomes funny in a way.
It's almost like a parody, right?
Yeah, exactly. Right. And so the protagonist of the giant...
Mad Magazine would have done it. It would have been this movie. Yeah.
So the protagonist of the giant Gila monster is a guy named Chase Winstead, played by Don Sullivan. He is a working class Texas boy. He runs his dead father's auto shop and gas station all by himself. He's bringing home the bread and paying the bills. He's supporting his mother and his disabled sister. And in the movie, like, he has a very close relationship with the sheriff of the movie, Sheriff Jeff, played by Fred Graham. And basically, like, he's kind of like the leader of the youth gang, because he's the one who, and again, the sheriff character says this explicitly, he keeps the kids in line. Right. He makes sure that all of their drag races are sanctioned by the sheriff. He's the one making sure that they're not just drinking and raising hell. He's the one who organizes, like, the record hops and the trips to the drive-in. He's like a wholesome force in his community too. Right. And so...
Right, but there's no real... And what's really funny is there's no real evidence that things with the other teenagers would break apart if this guy wasn't here. I mean, there's nothing's shown like he's pulled people in.
Right, it all operates... Again, but that's the thing, it goes back... And again, we can think about J. Edgar Hoover. Like, in order to understand what the movie is portraying, you need to understand the culturally conservative presumption at the time.
Right, it's Texas.
That this is a problem that is unique to something that is spontaneously arising out of young people, as opposed to anything to do with any systemic problem. Right. Which we can see with, Don Sullivan's character himself, because again, he is just this like 18-year-old kid who's running a business, who like and again, he's like this ideal, he's this totally...
doesn't sleep.
Exactly. We noted this in the movie. Like, he seems to be awake for like 72 hours straight, because he's either working at the body shop, or he's organizing like healthy activities for the youth, or he's conducting an independent investigation with the police into a series of mysterious auto deaths that turn out to be the result of a giant Gila monster that's roaming throughout the land. And you notice, once again, just like with the Killer Shrews, except even less so, no radiation is involved.
Right.
There is no systemic influence on the problem. And again, once again, Mcclendon is the narrator at the beginning of The Killer Shrews, and he has another narration at the beginning of The Giant Gila Monster, and he puts up the only plausible explanation we get to the size of the Gila Monster is just basically just a one-off of like, no one knows quite how large the Gila Monster grows in size. And so it's all just naturally arising.
Right.
There's nothing...
Right. Because blizzards grow continuously.
Right.
But they slow down to an asymptote.
Yeah,
So they essentially don't grow.
And eventually there's this really weird scene where Sheriff Jeff is just like poring over like cryptid stories, like stuff he could have pulled from the National Enquirer. And like this is how he conveys to like this teenage boy that I think there's a giant Gila monster that's killing kids.
I stepped out. I don't know. How did they get to that jump? I must have stepped out and came back in. So, well, how did they arrive at that?
No. So, okay, so...
Isn't the guy thinks that there's really a Gila monster?
So this is the thing. Yeah. Again, it's an interesting thing because the movies are, again, they have a reputation for being some of the worst examples of these films, but this is actually a very well made movie.
It is.
For its type, especially for its budget. It opens very well. It's just these two teens making out in a car in the woods. There's some off-screen threat. They try to veer away. It's like very quick-paced and sudden. The car gets destroyed, and then you see this giant claw descending onto the screen to like the monster is going to eat them. And then later in the plot, there is a car that's discovered. An abandoned car, seemingly, that's discovered in a ravine off the road. We don't discover until several minutes later that that's not the same car that we saw at the opening of the movie where the teens died. And so there's like 20 to 30 minutes of this movie where we have no idea
what's going on.
or even when they're going to discover.
Right.
And there's almost like, and again, it is this very cool way of establishing uncertainty and tension because all we know is that the teenagers are missing and like they think that maybe they eloped to get married. And that's how we introduce this sort of, this character, Mr. Wheeler, who is the local millionaire who is distrustful.
Some business, right?
Yeah, exactly. He's distrustful of the youth. You know, and that's the thing, like, that you have to have the scene where Sheriff Jeff, tells off Mr. Wheeler and
exposition.
says... Yeah, because
Total exposition.
Yeah, the exposition dump, because Mr. Wheeler does not trust Chase Winstead, and so Sheriff Jeff gets this great moment where he's like, listen, that kid is the only one who's holding this town together. Right. This 18-year-old boy is
lost his father. The whole thing's laid out.
Yeah, exactly.
In that one exposition, which is fine.
If you ask me, it's that Chase Winston. He's older than the others, sets them all wrong. Why, he's got more influence on Pat than I have.
Chase Winstead does more about keeping them in line than getting them in trouble, and I know. He's supported his mother and sister ever since his dad died on one of your drill rigs. Your son could take a page out of his book, Mr. Wheeler.
Which is funny, because, again, we're establishing, there's this theme of this common thread throughout these movies of, like, generational conflict, but imagined in this movie as this very idealistic portrayal of a sort of bootstraps narrative of this kid who just through hard work and grit and a clear, traditionally American conservative
He knows
moral...
how to make nitro.
Well, he doesn't know how to make nitro. He just gets the nitro.
I couldn't remember. What was that used for initially?
I don't remember. I can splice it in, but all that we know is that...
And that's not the exposition, which is fine.
All that we know is that there's like some old guy who works with him at the auto shop on and off who just tells him... there's like a delivery of nitro that is... I think it's supposed to go to like...
construction or something,
Yeah, for some local construction. And it turns out that he's just transferred the nitroglycerin to mason jars. And so they just put it away,
There's some shack, right.
Yeah, but Chase Winstead is a smart kid, and so he knows that he's listened to all the PSAs. He knows that nitro... he paid attention in chemistry. He's an A student. He knows that the nitroglycerin is dangerous, so he puts it away in a reasonably safe place, and that's our Chekhov's gun for the movie. Is that like, okay, so the nitroglycerin is introduced in the first act, so we know it's going to go off in the third. But yeah, there's like this tension that's very well teased out in the movie,
right,
because it's not just the teens are killed and then their car is discovered. There's this established mystery which is presented, which is made completely separate from the car they discovered. We as the spectator know they're connected in some way, so that when the teenagers themselves, when Chase Winstead and his friends finally discover the blood-spattered car of their friend at the bottom of the ravine and tow it out, it's a much more morbid and suspenseful way of teasing out the story that I think is particularly well done. It's a very nice way to compound the stakes, because, and again, it feeds into the opposition between Sheriff Jeff and Mr. Wheeler, because Sheriff Jeff is forced to acknowledge to Mr. Wheeler that basically Chase Winstead just tampered with a crime scene, a potential crime scene, and that, like, you know, and he puts it to Sheriff Jeff that, like, you're doing a terrible job because, you know, it was literally only a few hundred yards from the place that you found one wreck that this other wreck was discovered, and my kid is probably dead. And so Sheriff Jeff is basically just forced to concede that he is dependent entirely on this 18-year-old teenager.
It's an alibi.
Yeah, exactly, to hold everything together. And so that's where the weird, like, moralizing of the movie comes from, where it's
he even tells him, yeah, go ahead, take the headlight. Well, who's going to know, right?
Yeah, there's another part where he
and then the tires go on.
That's the other weird thing, is like, Chase Winstead is allowed to take the headlight from a car that could be potentially involved in a crime scene, but because Sheriff Jeff just doesn't want to give him a ticket for his out headlight that he can't pay for. Again, like, so there's almost like this folksy conservative morality that I remember I was talking to you about it. It's like the morality of the movie is something that is so
it's relative.
Right. Well, no, that's the thing. It's not relative it's only relative in the sense that characters routinely don't obey the law. Like, Sheriff Jeff just, like, lets characters go for drunk driving. Like, there's this one character who's played by Shug Fisher, who is, like, one of these old Western and country comedy and singer types. He's an old character performer. He plays a guy named Old Man Harris, who is constantly driving around drinking from a bottle of hooch. And at one point he comes into the police station to report, you know, citing the Gila monster. But, like, you know, rather than arresting him, he just has him go sleep it off in the jail cell.
Lock yourself in a cell and go sleep it off, right.
And so that's the thing, that there's this tension to the story in that, again, there's a parallel tension to the story. One is the superficial tension of the Gila monster. The other is the social tension, which is that Sheriff Jeff is in this impossible situation where he's the one man in this very small, in charge of this entire small...
He even tells him, well, if you think you can do a better job doing 10,000 square miles with one car and... Yeah, then you do it.
He basically admits that, like, I can't follow the letter of the law because if I did, it's impossible for me to do that. Like, so it's not relative. It's a movie that has a moral compass which is placed above the law. Right. There is some higher virtue that everyone,
as opposed to the police adjective.
Right.
Where the law is the law.
Yeah, the law
Very
is the law.
interesting. Go ahead. I'm sorry. Sorry to interrupt you. Go ahead.
Yeah, but there's this whole mystery of these missing teenagers, but slowly, after a few more automobile accidents, it's sort of determined that there's something not quite right going on.
I love it. In fact, when they finally realize that, well, I forget how exactly they make the jump, that there may be because the drunk guy says it was a giant pink lizard.
Yeah, and Chase Winstead is able to put it together, like, oh, hey, that's how they tie it together, because Chase Winstead, there's a subplot of the movie where, so Chase Winstead, in addition to being an this is the thing, he's like the perfect calculated image of a youth teen marketing. He has all the fashion accoutrement. He has the souped up hot rod. He even offers to soup up the sheriff's cars so that it will run really fast. And like, he's also an aspiring rock singer. He plays a guitar and he has his own songs.
Well, there's 3 songs, right?
Right. And at one point he tows a drunk guy who's a DJ, who is a DJ, and the DJ is actually played by a guy named Ken Cox. Ken Cox was actually a DJ who was a broadcaster on one of Gordon McLendon's own radio stations. He was actually a guy who was one of those top 40 rock and vocal pop radio jockeys. So he appears in this film as another one of these Texas locals in this locally produced Texas movie.
Well, he's in the city, right?
Yeah, he's a sort of city guy who's just sort of rolling through this.
What's his name again?
The character's name is Horatio Alger Smith. Now, of course, in case my listener doesn't know, Horatio Alger is the name of a late 19th century Gilded Age author who is most famous for writing young adult novels which are about these poor and working class characters who, especially young characters, especially teenagers, who through sheer hard work and grit and moral fortitude are able to ascend through the social ranks of society and make like proper, wealthy men out of themselves. So explicitly you have inserted into this movie just the most, and I remember like your perception of the movie was like, the way you put it was like it was almost like a movie produced by the John Birch Society. The John Birch Society.
It's really funny, like I said, and not to interrupt, I want you to keep your thought there. But the idea is that when I was younger, these things fly over your head.
Yeah.
But I want to make a point to your listeners. These new movies need to be seen again.
Yeah.
From a different cultural perspective of age and what they need to be seen again. I think a lot of times people just see them once or twice when they're younger and they cast them off. But I don't think anybody's done a real critical look at these films when they're older.
Right.
With a whole different perspective. The other thing about this idea is that, what's the protagonist's name? Chase Winstead.
Yeah.
It's kind of funny. He now has a foot. Well, I don't get too far ahead of this movie.
Yeah.
He has a foot now in the rich world, but there's something about the folksiness and moral underpinnings that say he wants to keep his foot in the old world.
Yeah.
It's very interesting. I don't know if you got that kind of sense.
Well, it's sort of like, it's a very Horatio Alger's thing to happen in the story, because he's a very hardworking, but even in a Horatio Alger's book, there will always be like some fortuitous chance meeting, like the right connection that a character makes. And so he meets up with this DJ, and the DJ is thoroughly drunk. And so again, he doesn't like take him into the police for drunk driving. He just tows his car with him in it. The DJ sleeps it off overnight. But as he's waking up in the morning, he hears Chase singing one of his songs.
Well, what does he do though when he wakes up? He gets up and he checks his wallet.
Yeah, he's worried that like this kid fucking aced him.
He has like his eyebrows. Oh,
he realizes this is a good kid.
It's all there.
This is a good Samaritan. A good Samaritan story. Right. Yeah, again, very much this and not just but like that's the end, because that's how Chase knows, because the guy says when he's drunk that he saw something orange and black dotting across the road. And so when Sheriff Jeff brings up what Shug Fisher's character saw, which is something similar, they put 2 and 2 together and they realize, oh, there's a giant Gila monster on our hands. But in the case of this scene, it's like, again, it's this, like you're saying, it's this door in. He's made the right fortuitous connection, and so now what's going to happen is that at the climactic barn dance and the hop, I suppose.
Elizabeth doesn't like the sound.
This local DJ that everyone knows is going to personally show up.
That's not unusual. That's pretty common back in that. If you looked up, it's not unusual for them to hold private things like that.
Yeah, but how often do they invite some just kid who works at the local auto body parts station to come up and sing one of his songs? Yeah, like that's the thing. He plays one of Chase's records. Apparently, Chase has like a 45, or
how did he cut
or
it?
they record.
When did he cut
like at some point off screen. Okay, yeah, there's no understanding of time really here. Like we made this joke because Chase this is what we're not seeing off screen. Chase is just like rolling on mountains of cocaine. That is the only way that he's able to like even keep afloat. He's been up for weeks. It's a very horrific story underneath. But yeah, and so Chase actually...
No, it isn't because of that. It's just it seems like you said, when did he's been asleep? He hasn't been asleep?
Yeah, no one goes...
Well, he's the perfect...
He's the perfect American salt of the earth.
Right.
And again, you're right. It's like there's 2 feet. There's it's a totally aspirational and uniquely conservative conception of an aspirational class fantasy.
Right.
And in a way, it's like
it works when you're white.
Right, it works when you're white, but it also works when you're already rich. But again, when it's Gordon McLendon, now a millionaire, doing it, you get this it's a old borderline propagandistic.
It is.
And it's an Afro-turfed fantasy that he is now, as this exploitation filmmaker, it's almost like this is J. Edgar Hoover's answer to the idea that these films have a pernicious effect on the young. It's almost like a deliberate fantasy that he's selling to the young people who are watching this movie. Again, Horatio Alger's the DJ. Who thinks of this? I'll tell you who thinks of this. It's someone who is deliberately thinking from the perspective of, I'm going to use my movies to promote the sorts of moral and political and economic values that I want to see replicated.
Remember I said it came up in that one scene where the husband and wife are looking for their daughter who's killed.
Yeah.
Right?
These are the working class ones. Because the son is from the rich Mr. Wheeler, but there's these 2 podunk guys who are clearly actual podunk people, non-professional actors who are cast in the scene. But yeah, go on. They're these.
But they says, well, thank you, Sheriff, for trying to do all you can.
Unlike Mr. Wheeler, who's got a whole bunch of fucking questions. Yeah, but yeah.
But Wheeler comes around eventually.
Yeah,
because he puts 2 and 2
together.
Well,
he gets fucking deputized.
Right, but not that, but he can't do a good job. He realizes he has to let everybody go. He said, well, see how easy it is? Anyway, so he gets his comeuppance as well. But the idea is he doesn't die, though. They say, have faith in God. As they turn around, as they exit back into the house, whether their daughter's alive or dead,
Yeah.
And I just said,
I mean,
if I were a parent and that was something to my kids, I would have that shirt would be hanging from a tree until he found her, which wouldn't help.
But that's the thing, that is, and again, that's a part of the explicit morality of film. So let's talk about Chase Winstead, the musical artist. Because we only hear as source music his 2 rock songs that he has on this 45 that Horatio Algers has printed up for him. But he has another song, and this is the centerpiece song that he plays twice in the movie. Once to his disabled sister, and again at the barn dance and hop. So this is called the Mushroom Song.
Oh my God!
And this is the most bizarre song.
Smoking it?
Exactly. This is the thing, is that there's this weird way that it's because it's not rock and roll. It's a gospel song. But it's a gospel song that has these tinges of almost proto-psychedelic lyrics.
Pat Boone.
Yeah, exactly. But look, I just want to read these lyrics, okay? There was a mushroom, sad little mushroom. There was a meadow ready to cry. There was a sparrow, gray little sparrow. There was an eagle silent and high. And the Lord said, laugh, children, laugh. The Lord said, laugh, children, laugh. The Lord said, laugh, children, laugh. The Lord said, laugh, laugh, laugh. The second verse is where it gets really Christian. And the Lord, he said, I created for you a world of joy from out of the blue, and all that is left to complete the joy, just a laugh of a girl and a boy. And there was a garden, beautiful garden, held in the arms of a world without joy. Then there was laughter, wonderful laughter, for he created a girl and a boy. So it's a veiled Adam and Eve story just plopped into the middle of this movie that is introduced by his... Okay, so what happens is he comes home one night after he's made Horatio Algiers has given him a hot $20. $220s. He's got $40 from Horatio Algiers.
He only wanted 3.
And he's like, oh God, I'm going to be able to pay for the leg braces that my polio-stricken sister needs so that she can walk again. But
I'll get a record.
But he walks into the door and he finds that she already has the braces because his girlfriend Lisa has already bought
Who works for Wheeler
has already bought the braces for her. And so his little sister, and that's the other thing, Chase's mom and little sister,
they're okay.
And little sister are played by Gordon McLendon's wife and daughter.
They're all right.
Yeah, they do all right.
Yeah.
But so she tries to walk in the braces, but she can't quite yet. So she gets upset and starts crying, and so he sings this song to her as a way to cheer her up, and it's just the most it's the most awkward and forced thing because, like, it's basically just telling her, yeah, sure, everything sucks, but, you just gotta, just, like, fly straight, sing, because remember, God created the world just for you from Adam and Eve, and he loves all of us. Again, it's a movie that does not even really try to veil its, not just its political leanings, but specifically its culturally and religiously oriented leanings, that there is very much this idea that where it's coming from is imprinting upon its audience a conservative... It's the Protestant work ethic. It's not just that if you work hard, it's that this working hard is the way that you prove yourself worthy of wealth. It's like wealth and success and health, these all come as blessings by you proving yourself.
It's really the underpinnings of what we have today is prosperity Christianity in many ways.
Yes, very much so. That's politically where the movie is coming from, very overtly, and it sort of culminates in, again, like the way the scholars put it, the idea of these movies all working towards an end where these clean-cut kids need to put away their childish things, which is all working towards when... Again, the Chekhov's gun of the nitroglycerin. Chase takes the nitroglycerin, puts it in his hot rod, and fucking kamikazes the giant Gila monster and destroys it. So he has to give up the one thing in the world he loves more than anything else in order to destroy the monster. And through this, through this self-sacrifice, he illustrates that he's ready to join the adult world. He's ready to... I don't know. I guess it's like it's a coming of age story where no one really comes of age though, because he's already there. He's already there. Like, it's really just like it's this back-patting conservative fantasy. We all know what is supposed to be morally upstanding. Again, it's all this folksy common sense, you can't just arrest everybody, you gotta it's like, who's a good person and who's a bad.
Can I open it up? Open it up. Go ahead.
Yeah, exactly. That's the thing. The
sheriff's in the back.
Yeah, the sheriff is the letter. The sheriff is the law. The law is not the law. The sheriff is the law. He's the person who's put in charge.
Wheeler does come around, convinces the sheriff that there is a giant... Have you ever been in that pass and walked it from the north end to the south end?
Yeah, so everyone's...
Whatever pass that was, a ravine that they were talking about where the thing was hiding.
Yeah, and that's another thing, that it torpedoes any chance of there being any kind of class conflict.
Right.
Because you're right, there is this element of, yes, Mr. Wheeler is overly judgmental, and a lot of his prejudices come from his class. He just doesn't trust even Chase Winstead, this unimpeachable saint of a boy. He has these arbitrary suspicions of that he needs to get dressed down about. But inevitably, everybody comes together. It's like there's no essential class conflict. Again, all crises just sort of spontaneously manifest, but the world itself as it exists is perfect. Everyone who has anything has it by just some virtue of natural force or some inscrutable act of God.
Correct.
Everyone comes together at the end. Everyone learns a lesson about harmony and being together, and we've successfully put down the put down the devil in the form of the giant Gila monster.
It was a good movie. I liked it.
It was. Like, I am hard pressed to understand. I would understand not liking certain aspects of the movie or considering them objectively poorly done, because there are cases where there are elements of the movie that are objectively poorly done, both movies. But I do not understand how these films, out of any others, ascended to the ranks of being considered the worst. I just don't get
it either.
And I think it's especially compounded with the giant Gila monster, because we talked about this, like, again, thanks to Ray Kellogg, this is a film that sort of accepts its limitations. So one of the limitations is the giant Gila monster never appears on screen at the same time as any of the human beings or the on-location sets.
Right. But miniatures are pretty good, as you mentioned.
That's what I was about to say. Yeah. The miniatures are genuinely well done.
Yeah.
The photography of the giant Gila monster, the regular Gila monster, like, obviously it has that general problem where you can tell it's just a Gila monster because, like, you know, like, again, it's like those subtle cues that we have as human beings of how physics work. You may not know a lot about the technicalities of physics, but when you see just a small grain of when you see the way grains of dirt move when a claw of an animal of a 1 foot long animal steps on it, your brain subconsciously knows the difference between that and how it would look if there was like a literal 50-foot claw coming down on the side of a ravine. You can tell those things. But even that said, like, you know, like, for the small budget, like, they got some pretty good artists to work within the medium. Like, these shots look genuinely good.
Yep.
I think you are absolutely right in terms of that the primary reason to revisit these movies in particular is that it does distill the ways in which we don't really appreciate... Because it's, like, people often talk about how, like, you can use old movies to understand the political or the cultural sensibilities of the time, but it's not really often the same for these low-budget movies. They're often really just written off just because of the fact that they're low-budget, because they have these eccentric or asinine plots, or because they're objectively badly made sometimes. But I think these two movies, they really do distill, in a way that can't really be expressed in other movies, a very specific conservative ethos, which is totally relevant to the present day. Like, you are seeing in this movie the development of a very modern conservative universe that is persistent throughout the 50s and the 60s and well into the 70s.
Whatever this intended to do didn't work. What I'm trying to say is, no, you have to be in that culture. You're really just talking to the crowd.
But I mean, it's sort of like you said about it
didn't affect my brother and I watched this. We didn't become more conservative because we saw.
But this is the thing. It's not about changing people's minds.
Well, that's what the intent was, wasn't it?
It wasn't. The intent was not to change people's minds. The intent was to influence them.
Yeah, but it didn't influence us.
How do you know?
Because like, this is here's how you agree with half the shit. And the other thing is that as adults, when we look at it, we can see But this is exactly... see the tripe that's in here.
But here's the thing. It's the same thing with the killer shrews, where, you know, I'm talking about, you know, how, like, again, like, it is very much this hyper-masculinist, you know, very much steep in Western tropes movies. Yes. You know, with all of it,
bad guy,
but not just good guy, bad guy, but with all these attendant themes of manifest destiny and the natural order in which white people are naturally ascendant to be in control, not just of other people, but of nature itself. Of how the arc of justice will always bend towards tradition and towards this stability. How you always need this. This strategically deployed brutalistic strength that never goes quite over the edge, but is always ready to in an hour of crisis. You know, it's like this idea that there are no neutrals in war or things. It's like, these things don't impress themselves on you or make you want to change your mind. But like, it was like you said, I don't think it was that different from a lot of the things that I consumed when I was a kid.
Yeah.
You know, I think this is the thing, is that, like, what's valuable about these movies is not so much that they're radically different politically. I think their value is that they distill so explicitly, when you're a discerning adult looking back at it through the decades, they distill what is pervasive throughout a culture.
Right. They represent the represent the
what becomes normalized to you, what doesn't
right.
seem like the point isn't that it makes you want to grow up and say, well, I'm gonna join the Young John Birch Society.
Well,
you know,
but that's
but what it does,
right? But those who do are not people that are affected by these movies. They're already intrinsically in those kinds of situations where they automatically affiliate.
Right.
It's not.
But what pop
it's
culture,
cool though.
Right. But what pop culture does do is it does normalize sensibilities. It does limit the scope of imagination.
I know, but the idea is, but the sense of normalization was lost on us. We saw it as a monster movie with some good kid that's smart and he's able to defeat it. We didn't see it in the perspective.
Well, you didn't know who Horatio Alger was. You didn't know you were being propagandized to.
No, you didn't know who he was. So
you didn't know who Gordon McLendon was. You didn't know that, this is some fucking fat cat millionaire.
But the point is that now you look at him when you're
John Wayne's good buddy, Ray Kellogg and Ken Curtis.
That's what I said when I was in
Fred Graham, another John Ford and John Wayne acolyte. I think he was in The Searchers, actually. It is what it is.
It is what it is, and I just remember... I remember when I went to California to study, and I went to the John Birch Society. It was called Knott's Berry Farm.
Wait. Knott's Berry Farm is connected with the John Birch Society?
Yes, Knott's Berry Farm in California is the John Birch Society.
There was a mushroom, sad little mushroom. There was a meadow, ready to cry. There was a sparrow, gray little sparrow. There was an eagle, silent and high. And the Lord said, laugh, children laugh. The Lord said, laugh, children laugh. The Lord said, laugh, children laugh. The Lord said, laugh, laugh, laugh. Then the Lord, he said, I created for you a world of joy from out of the blue. And all that is left to complete the joy, just the laugh of a girl and boy. Yay, 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 yay. And there was a garden, beautiful garden, held in the arms of a world without joy. And then there was laughter, wonderful laughter, for he created a girl and a boy. And the Lord said, oh, laugh, children laugh. The Lord said, 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 laugh, children laugh.